Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, originally for PlayStation Portable but later re-released for the Metal Gear Solid HD collection, which was available on PS3 and Xbox 360. What you're seeing here is the Xbox 360 version of that. This is a stealth action game by Kojima Productions and published by Konami in April of 2010 for the PSP, and then it later saw a re-release in November of 2011 for PS3 and Xbox 360. And it's interesting because, first off, it's a follow-up to Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops, which itself was the sort of straight-up sequel to Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater. And this is also the follow-up to Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots. So it's just kind of all over the place in where it sits in the series, but if you go by the chronological order, it goes Metal Gear Solid 3, followed by Portable Ops, followed by this. And then the actual sequel to this is Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain. So they just kind of threw this monkey wrench into the series chronology with the portable games, and it ends up being kind of a mess. But this thing was pretty well received when it came out, and when it got re-released on consoles instead of just the PSP, there's a very solid chance that it sold actually better on the consoles than it did on PSP. It doesn't really help that the PSP just really didn't sell all that well outside of Japan, and so while this game did see some mild success over there, it didn't really do all that well in the world at large. So I guess the questions then become, first off, how did it being built for a handheld gaming system affect the overall design and story and everything like that? And more importantly, is this kind of an overlooked gem, or is it just kind of a footnote in the Metal Gear Solid franchise's history? Now, as far as presentation goes, let's face it, this thing is not a looker. It was originally released on PlayStation Portable, and it really looks like it. You've got a lot of really low-res textures. The modeling is often kind of blocky. Characters look kind of odd. The animations in general are a bit stiff sometimes, and most telling of all, the environments are very small, especially when you compare them to the previous games. Of course, they did what they could with what they had. The PSP is not, by any stretch of the imagination, a powerful system, but it would have been nice if they had actually made this thing to proper console hardware spec when they did the HD re-release, instead of simply updating the resolution and mildly updating some of the texture work and such. But there is one change that is wildly at odds with what we're used to in terms of Metal Gear Solid's presentation, and that is the cutscenes. They're in this weird graphic novel comic book style, and as you can see, they're in black and white. And on occasion, the game will actually allow you to interact with these cutscenes by giving you a button prompt that you can press to do certain things, but generally speaking, the interactions with the cutscenes are extremely minimal and, frankly, kind of pointless. So it just kind of begs the question of why they even bothered sticking those in there to begin with. But there is one positive thing about this, if you really hate the cutscene-heavy games of the past. The cutscenes in this are relatively short. So no longer will you have to sit through half an hour of ridiculously over-melodramatic dialogue. Now you only have to sit through maybe 5 to 10 minutes of it. And obviously, depending on how you look at the Metal Gear Solid series, that's either an improvement or it's an irredeemable atrocity or something like that. At least the sound design's still intact. That's one thing that didn't necessarily suffer on PSP. Unfortunately, they didn't get Harry Gregson Williams to do the soundtrack for this one, and it kinda shows because most of the music in this is actually pretty forgettable. But it certainly does fit the Metal Gear Solid vibe, and it definitely fits the moments that it's in. Unfortunately, as I said, it's very forgettable. There's no specific themes that stick out. I mean, with previous Metal Gear Solid games, there was always at least one or two tracks, usually more than that really stuck out. With MGS1, you had things like the Encounter theme, the actual Metal Gear Solid theme. You had The Best Is Yet to Come. MGS2's soundtrack had the Metal Gear Solid theme rendition as well, and of course Metal Gear Solid 3 had Snake Eater among other things. And even with Metal Gear Solid 4, they had things like Metal Gear Saga. But then you get to Peace Walker, and the most memorable track is the J-pop theme it plays when you're fighting the final boss, And that's not memorable in the good way like the previous songs I mentioned. It's memorable in the sense of, why the hell is this playing during this boss fight? So that's kind of problematic, but other than that, the soundtrack at least fits what's going on for the most part. Similarly, the sound effects fit what's going on for the most part, but aren't particularly memorable or beefy. But hey, it's a Metal Gear Solid game, and more importantly, it's a PSP game, so I can put that aside. And then there's the voice acting, which actually tends to take you out of the experience. The story itself is actually portrayed very seriously in this one, and while there certainly are silly moments throughout the game, generally speaking, it is trying to play things pretty seriously, and the voice acting is just goofy. I mean, it's one thing when David Hayter always just kind of sounds goofy in the role of Snake, and that's just something we've come to accept. But then there's Tara Strong attempting to do a Hispanic accent with Paz, and while I applaud her trying to do something with it, it ends up coming across as silly more often than not. And things like that make it kind of hard to get in the mood of what's going on simply by nature of the voice acting being kind of corny and ridiculous, and the plot being both ridiculous and being played incredibly seriously at times, so that you just kind of end up confused more than anything else. That said, when the game is being intentionally silly, the voice acting fits perfectly. I mean, for example, there's the one conversation that I unfortunately don't have any footage for, so I'll post a link in an annotation to an animation of that conversation that is just amusing as hell, where they're talking about a cardboard tank that you can get in the game. And when I first heard that conversation, I was laughing my ass off. So at least they managed to get the silliness down to a ridiculous degree. They just didn't succeed so well when they tried to make it serious. And considering the plot is always incredibly important in the Metal Gear Solid games, that becomes a pretty big problem. As I mentioned, the plot tends to take itself very seriously, and what we have here is actually a sequel to Portable Ops, oddly enough. Now, if you're not familiar with that one, don't worry, I'm not really familiar with it either, other than the fact that it was released on PSP and was a spin-off in the series. But suffice to say, when you got a sequel to a game that was just kind of a spin-off becoming one of the main entries in the series, as opposed to one of the side entries in the series, it makes things kind of complicated for figuring out the timeline. As far as Peace Walker goes, it is set 4 years after the events of Portable Ops in 1974, and Big Boss, who still prefers going by his old codename Snake, is now running his own mercenary group, and I'm gonna butcher the pronunciation of this, I'm sure, because my French is terrible, but I believe you pronounce it Militaires Sans Frontières. But of course, if you're a native speaker of French, feel free to correct me on that. I'm only going to refer to it as MSF from now on anyway. But he and Kazuhira Miller are actually running that together in South America, and they are approached by a guy named Ramon Galvez Mena, who is a professor at the University of Peace, and he brings his student Paz Ortega Andrade to speak with MSF and hire them to do something about an army that has secretly occupied parts of Costa Rica. And to make a long story somewhat short and trying not to go too heavily into spoiler territory here, Snake does end up agreeing to investigate the army and finds out that they are working on an AI-controlled nuclear tank codenamed Peace Walker, which is going to be used by an agent named Hot Cold Man, I wish I was making that name up, but I'm not, to launch a nuclear attack and basically guarantee retaliation by the Soviet Union. At least that's a highly condensed and mostly spoiler-free version of the plot. Suffice to say, it's a pretty ridiculous plot, and it's extremely hard to suspend your disbelief at any point throughout the entirety of the story. And that's only made worse once you finally get to the real ending of the game, which involves the nuclear tank that MSF has been producing that they have codenamed Metal Gear Zeke. And I don't really want to spoil that for you, but suffice to say, the twist itself, or at least what was supposed to be a twist anyway, ends up being just as ridiculous, if not more ridiculous than what you've already experienced up to that point, and frankly is a huge letdown. The plot in general in this game is just kind of a mess. Again, there's no real way you can get attached to anything that's going on. The plot itself is so ridiculous and out there that you just cannot suspend your disbelief very well. And the characters that are introduced in Peace Walker really aren't that interesting. I mean, if you've played Metal Gear Solid 3, you can easily see that Snake himself has developed somewhat as a character, considering that he is no longer the rather naive agent he was in Metal Gear Solid 3. Now he's a very grizzled and disillusioned soldier who doesn't really have anything to fight for necessarily. And throughout Peace Walker, he's really still trying to come to terms with what happened in Metal Gear Solid 3. And this is where you really start to see him become more of the villain that he would be later on on in the series. But he's not quite there yet, and in some respects he is still definitely a heroic soldier, and the game generally does a decent job of portraying Snake as such, but he's really the exception rather than the rule. Most of the characters don't really have much of an arc, and they're just kind of taking a back seat to the ridiculous plot elements and what's going on inside Snake's head. And while there is still a lot of melodramatic dialogue, it's mercifully a lot shorter than the previous games in the series simply by nature of this being made for a handheld device rather than a home console, and that does permeate both its plot and its gameplay. You see, the game itself is broken up into a series of missions, and each of these missions can be a different thing. You can either have a main story mission, which will of course progress the story, you'll have cutscenes and everything like that, or you can go on one of the various side ops, which is not tied to the story, but it does have a bunch of gameplay that you can do. And this is a massive difference from what we had in the previous Metal Gear Solid games, where it was all one continuous game, and the gameplay and plot both reflected that. With this, they designed it more around the smaller game sessions that you would do on a handheld device. So the missions themselves end up being maybe 10 to 15 minutes at most usually, and so the storytelling itself ends up being a lot more vignette oriented, where you have these pretty short missions with fairly short cutscenes accompanying them that all blend together to make pretty targeted storytelling. And frankly, that style of storytelling does not work very well with Metal Gear Solid. The style that Hideo Kojima put together for this entire series has always been a lot more oriented on themes and underlying messages than it has around the actual events of the plot. And when you're doing that in a vignette style, you end up making something that is actually a lot less cohesive. So it ultimately falls to the gameplay to bring this thing up, and the gameplay really suffers as a result of being on a handheld device. What you basically get here is an amalgam of things from the previous Metal Gear Solid games all slapped together into one package, and given mission structures that are very short and very, very samey. For the vast majority of missions, what you end up doing is one of a few things. 1. You infiltrate an area, extract a certain person or various people, and then you exfiltrate. 2. You infiltrate an area, you destroy an objective, then you exfiltrate. 3. You infiltrate an area, you fight a vehicle that will also spawn various foot soldiers, and then you exfiltrate. Or 4. You go into an area and you have a boss fight. And the boss fights in this are some of the most boring that you will ever see in the Metal Gear Solid series. Every single one of them is fighting a damaged sponge enemy that you just hit numerous times in its big glowing hit me here light area. None of the really cool, unique boss fights like the one with the End or the one with the Sorrow. Nope, just some really basic fights against some mechanized foes, and once you've beaten them, they go down and you can get into their AI pod, take a bunch of AI modules, and then use them to upgrade Metal Gear Zeke. Of course, what makes things worse with Metal Gear Zeke is that you basically have to go back and fight these bosses over and over and over again in order to get the various parts you need to be able to upgrade Metal Gear Zeke. So you can actually go back and redo any of the missions at any point. Say you want a better rank on it, and you got an A rank and you want to do an S rank. Well, you can go back and redo that mission until you get an S rank. And when you apply it to boss fights, you basically end up grinding for parts for Metal Gear Zeke. And that gets really tedious. And that, combined with how samey the missions are, ends up making this thing wear thin very, very quickly. The core movement, shooting, and equipment controls are pretty much how they were in Metal Gear Solid 4, actually, to where you basically have a standard third-person aiming perspective now with a crosshair instead of going into a first-person zoom mode. And this is far more comfortable than that awkward first-person aiming system they had in Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3, and of course the Twin Snakes. But the crosshair itself is kinda huge, so you end up having to be very careful with where you actually put your shots. You need to be very aware of where the actual center of the crosshair is. But of course it certainly works a hell of a lot better than that really awkward aiming system you had in the first 3 Metal Gear Solid games, as well as Twin Snakes, obviously. That is definitely one of the best changes they made in Metal Gear Solid 4 with regards to the core control scheme and everything. But apart from that, it really just feels like a watered-down version of the previous Metal Gear Solid games. Your tactical options are a hell of a lot more limited in this one. You can only actually have 2 primary weapons. By that I mean pistols, shotguns, assault rifles, sniper rifles, launchers of various kinds. You can only have 2 of those in your inventory at any time, and you also have a limited number of slots for your various throwable items like grenades or C4 charges or whatever, as well as very limited slots for your actual inventory. Things like the absolutely ridiculous Fulton extraction system where you can attach it to knocked out enemies and it will pull them up into the air and send them back to Mother Base, which is something I'll get to in a moment, or other things like various tools or health recovery items. And so you do have to plan out your missions in advance, and luckily the game does give you the option of going through a loadout screen rather than just starting up the mission immediately, and so you can use that to equip yourself for the mission ahead. If you know you're going to be going up against a boss, for example, or you know you're going to be going up against a vehicle, you can equip yourself accordingly, as opposed to just being caught without anything that would actually help you in that situation. So that is appreciated, but it does limit what you can actually do. And especially early on, your gear selection is going to be very, very limited. So that is something you're going to have to keep in mind. Another thing you're going to have to keep in mind is that you have the whole Mother Base thing to attend to. This is the management portion of the game where you can go into the Mother Base menus and start messing around with things like staff placement, as well as research and development, where you can get various better bits of equipment as you go along and unlock new R&D levels and such like that. Each particular aspect of MSF is improved over time, so it levels up as you gain more skilled workers in that particular area. And as it levels up, you get access to more capabilities. For example, unlocking various research projects and such. But the way you get these personnel is actually by extracting people from the various missions. So you can go into a mission, you can take non-lethal weaponry, or you can just sneak up behind enemies and knock them out and such like that. And then you can go and extract them with the Fulton system, and they'll be sent back to Mother Base where they can be assigned to work on various things and level up your various aspects of MSF so you can get access to more things. And you might think, hey, that sounds kind of weird, but also kind of cool because you've got this element of management strategy going on. Well, there's one really big problem with it. You can just hit auto-assign. In fact, it's preferable to hit auto-assign, because then the game will assign the various characters to whichever location they are most well-suited, and so it pretty much renders the staff management aspect of the game completely pointless, thus turning at least one aspect of the base management into really more of a nuisance than anything else. The R&D menu is simply going in and selecting various research projects to go off of and making sure that the amount of in-game currency that you have generated from completing missions and completing these various dispatch ops isn't going to run out, so that's another bit of really more busy work than anything else. And speaking of dispatch ops, you have the combat personnel that are part of MSF that you can send off on these various missions that they will do in the background, and when you complete missions on your own, then they will actually complete those missions that they are doing as well. And they'll come back to Mother Base with some rewards if they completed their mission successfully, as well as upgrading themselves as they do so. And you might think you want to watch those dispatch op fights, but you really don't need to because they're just summaries of what happened anyway, and so you don't really need to pay too much attention to that. And thus another element of the game ends up going kind of unused. I mean, you still do the dispatch ops anyway, you just don't pay attention to their nice graphics for when they're actually fighting things, which is something that is completely out of your control and consists of a bunch of icons with health meters attacking each other and one side emerging victorious. It's pretty lame, actually. Apart from that, you can upgrade and customize Metal Gear Zeke, but that's just another series of menus that you go through, and as I mentioned before, you have to grind in the boss fights in order to actually get parts for Metal Gear Zeke, which is just really tedious. So when you get down to it, the Mother Base stuff is really just an interesting idea that is ultimately not very well implemented, and ultimately ends up being more busy work than anything else. Now, there is one thing they do throw into this that might actually spice things up a bit, and that unfortunately I haven't been able to test, and that is co-op. You can actually go through most missions in both single-player and co-op modes, and co-op allows you to play with up to 3 other players and complete the missions together. Now, that might kind of sound odd because you'd probably have 4 Snakes running around, but actually what they do is they have your character be Snake, and then all the other characters appear as just other MSF operatives, which is kind of a cool way of handling it. You still get the idea that you are still Snake, while the other guys are just members of MSF that are helping you out. Unfortunately, like I said, I haven't really been able to test this because I don't really maintain a live gold subscription, and even if I did, I know that the player base for this is actually very small at this point, so the chances of me getting into a decent game with that would be pretty minimal. But I can't really imagine the co-op being all that great, considering that this game's actually pretty easy to begin with. So it'd probably be something of a joke in co-op, but anyway. The overall feeling I get from Peace Walker is just bizarre. On the one hand, it has some kinda cool ideas, none of which really pan out very well, and it's plagued by a mostly uninteresting, really convoluted, nonsensical plot that also is plagued by mostly uninteresting characters. And on top of that, the mission structure is incredibly samey and cramped. The gameplay itself just ends up being incredibly repetitive and ultimately tedious. And there's even a bunch of really weird design choices, like as you've seen throughout this entire video, the heads-up display and everything being vertical rather than horizontal, which makes it really annoying to keep track of. And yet, despite all of its problems, it really feels more like a matter of them just catering to the PSP rather than just it being a badly designed game. It feels like it's just very limited, and when you are playing it on an actual console like I am, it just ends up being extremely underwhelming. Sure, the game design is ultimately limited by the choice of platform here, but when you get down to it, this thing would work better on a console anyway, simply because of the extra analog stick that the PSP did not have. So it's so much easier to aim on the console than it is on PSP, and probably a hell of a lot less irritating. But when you do try to play it on a console and you compare it to the previous games, it just doesn't live up to them. Sure, it's got elements from previous games, like the control and aiming structure of Metal Gear Solid 4, the camo system of Metal Gear Solid 3, so on and so forth, but it's so watered down compared to the actual sources of those particular elements that it just ends up being both incredibly disappointing and ultimately pretty boring. Maybe if you're a die-hard fan of the Metal Gear Solid series, you'll be able to get a lot more out of it than I did, but I really can't recommend Peace Walker very much at all. I certainly don't hate this game like I hate Metal Gear Solid 2, but I barely got anything out of this. Maybe if you're a die-hard Metal Gear Solid fan, you'll be able to get a lot more out of it than I did, but ultimately, I really can't recommend Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker unless you get it for really cheap or you're a Metal Gear Solid fan. I give it a 2 out of 5. Thanks for watching.